without further ado, I will introduce our speaker this afternoon, Karen Thompson Walker. She's appearing as part of the Dark and Stormy Nights series for the first time, and she's the author of 2 novels. She was born and raised in San Diego and is a graduate of UCLA. While in college, she wrote for the Daily Bruin, and after graduation, worked as a journalist for a newspaper in San Diego. She completed her master's degree at Columbia University and continued to live in Brooklyn with her husband after earning her degree. Karen's first novel, The Age of Miracles, was published in 2012 and has been translated into 27 languages. It was a New York Times bestseller and named one of the best books of the year by People, the Oprah magazine, Financial Times, Kirkus Reviews, Publishers Weekly, Amazon, and Barnes & Noble. Her second novel, The Dreamers, was published in 2019 and was called Stunning by Emily St. John Mandel. It too was named a Best Book of the Year by Glamour, Real Simple, and Good Housekeeping. Today, Karen lives in Portland and is an assistant professor at University of Oregon's Creative Writing Department. Welcome, Karen, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here. The only thing would be even better if I was on the Oregon coast today. Except maybe it's raining today. Maybe
it is a little rainy today.
That's right. Say. But in general, yeah, I would have loved to come, and maybe some future time I'll come again. My family and I took a trip to Lincoln City this past, last fall, almost around this time, although it happened to be very sunny and it was very beautiful, and looking forward to coming back again. So let's see. Again, thanks for being here. And I wanted to say at the start that my sort of favorite part of these kinds of events is always the questions at the end. So I would love, if you do have questions, I'm just saying, please don't hesitate, throw any question you have out there. Really happy to kind of have a conversation if that appeals. But I'd love to start by, I'll start by talking a bit about, a little bit about both of my books, and then I'll read a bit from my most recent book, The Dreamers, and give you a sense of sort of, where I got the idea and maybe my kind of journey as a writer. So let's see. I think what I would say links my 2 books, The Age of Miracles and The Dreamers, is that they're both stories of ordinary people who are suddenly facing extreme and extraordinary circumstances. So in my first novel, so there's something about that really interests me, the way that these kinds of extreme situations, in this case, they're both kinds of disasters. But I'm interested in how those kinds of events affect and influence and put pressure on the ordinary relationships between people. And both books, in a way, examine how those kinds of situations both disrupt everyday life, definitely, but also all the ways that our kind of ordinary humanity persists, even in the face of these disastrous events. So my first novel, The Age of Miracles, is the story of a young girl and her family who wake up one morning to some terrifying news, which is that the rotation of the Earth, and the rest of the world wakes up to the news too, the rotation of the Earth has suddenly begun to slow down. And so that novel is partly the story of this unfolding global catastrophe, but it's also just as much a kind of coming of age story about this young girl named Julia, who is, who's in 6th grade and going through her 6th grade year against the backdrop of this kind of slow motion catastrophe. And then my most recent novel, The Dreamers, is about, which I feel like it seems important to say I wrote and published before the pandemic. You'll see why I mentioned that in a moment. But The Dreamers is about a new, mysterious, contagious disease. And I think a little later in this presentation, I'll talk a little more about how kind of uncanny at moments it's been to see a real contagion spread after inventing a version of it for my novel. But The Dreamers is about it's set in a small college town in California, a fictional college town called Santa Laura. And it's the story, it begins, this strange sickness begins on a dorm floor. I'm going to read a section in a moment that kind of gives you a sense of that. But the main symptom of this strange disease is a kind of seemingly endless sleep that otherwise at first seems ordinary. So people fall asleep and they just, 8 hours pass, 10 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours pass, and they just stay asleep. So I think just to give you a sense of how the feel of the writing and the feel of the book, I think I'm just going to read the first few pages now, and then I will say more about where I got the idea and sort of what my thinking was about that. And then later I'll talk about, as I said before, how kind of strange it's been to see our reality start to match, some early elements of something that I invented. Okay, so this is just chapter 1. I don't think I need to really introduce anything more about it. 1. At first, they blame the air. It's an old idea, a poison in the ether, a danger carried in by the wind. A strange haze is seen drifting through town on that first night, the night the trouble begins. It arrives like weather, or like smoke, some say later, but no one can locate any fire. Some blame the drought, which has been bleeding away the lake for years and browning the air with dust. Whatever this is, it comes over them quietly, a sudden drowsiness, a closing of the eyes. Most of the victims are found in their beds. But there are some who will tell you that this sickness is not entirely new, that its cousins have sometimes visited ours. In certain letters from earlier centuries, you may find the occasional reference, decades apart, to a strange kind of slumber, a mysterious, persistent sleep. In 1935, 2 children went to bed in a Dust Bowl cabin and did not wake for 9 days. Some similar contagion once crept through a Mexican village, El Niente they called it, the nothing. And 3,000 years before that, a Greek poet described a string of strange deaths in a village near the sea. They died, he wrote, as if overcome by sleep, or, according to a second translation, as if drowned in a dream. This time it starts at the college. It starts with a girl leaving a party. She feels sick, she tells her friends, like a fever, she says, like the flu, and tired, too, as tired as she has ever felt in her life. The girl's roommate, May, will later recall waking to the sound of the key turning in the lock. May will remember the squeak of the strings in the dark as her roommate, her name is Kara, climbs into the bunk above hers. She seems drunk, this girl, the way she moves so slowly from door to bed. But the room is dim, and, as usual, they do not speak. In the morning, May sees that Kara has slept in her clothes. The narrow black heels of her boots are sticking out beneath the blankets of the upper bunk. But May has seen her do this once before. She is careful not to wake her as she dresses. She is quiet with her keys and with the door. May leaves only the lightest possible impression on this space, the comfort of not being seen. This is California, Santa Laura, 6 weeks into May's freshman year. May stays away from the room all day. She feels better this way, still stunned by how quickly it happened, how the friendships formed without her, a thick and sudden ice. Sorry. Each evening, Kara and the other girls on the floor stand in towels in the bathroom, blocking the sinks as they lean toward the mirrors to line their lips and eyes. May can hear them laughing from the desk in her room across the hall, their voices loud above the hum of the blow dryers. It takes time to get to know people, her mother says over the phone. Sometimes it takes years. May spends her afternoons at the campus cafe, where, on this particular day in October, she waits until she is sure her roommate and the other girls will be gone from the floor, their hair dryers quiet, their flat irons cool, and the girls themselves enmeshed by then in the complicated rituals of their sororities. The boys, she hopes, will be at dinner. But when May gets back to the floor that night, 9 hours after she left it, she finds a note written in red on the whiteboard that hangs on their door. "We're leaving," it says. "Where are you?" These words, it is obvious, are meant for her roommate. When May unlocks the door, she finds Kara still lying where she left her that morning, her body curled toward the wall in the top bunk, her black boots still protruding from the sheets. "Kara," she says softly. Outside, the sun is sinking. The sky is clear and turning pink. May switches on the overhead light. "Kara," she says again. But Kara does not wake, not to the sound of May's pleading or to the louder voices of the two paramedics, who soon detect, through her badly wrinkled dress, that she is breathing at least, that she still has a pulse. Kara sleeps through the screaming of the other girls as they see the way her head rolls back against the stretcher, the way her mouth hangs open, her brown hair falling loose across her face. She sleeps through the screeching of the crickets in the pine trees outside and through the cool night air on her skin. May stands barefoot on the sidewalk as the paramedics slide the stretcher into the bright bubble of the ambulance. A little roughly, thinks May. Be careful, she wants to say. And then the doors swing shut without her, leaving May alone in the street. The paramedics will later report that the girl sleeps through the wail of the siren, too, and the flashing of the lights. She sleeps through the bumps of the potholed street as the ambulance rushes towards St. Mary's, where, after several attempts, 2 doctors find that they cannot wake her either. On the other floors of the hospital that night, women labor while the girl sleeps. Babies are born while she sleeps. She sleeps while an old man dies in a distant room, an expected death, his family gathered, a chaplain. She sleeps through sunrise and she sleeps through sunset. And yet, in those first few hours, the doctors can find nothing else wrong. She looks like an ordinary girl, sleeping ordinary sleep. There will be some confusion later about what happened to her there, how her heart could have slowed so much without setting off the monitors. But this much is known to be true. Over the course of many hours, her shallow breaths turn gradually shallower. It is hard to say afterward why the final beats of her heart go unrecorded by those machines. So that's the first few pages of The Dreamers. And I think maybe I'll talk for a few minutes about where I got the idea, which was, years before our current pandemic, and some of the research that I did. So let's see, I first got the idea when I was living in an actual college town in Iowa City. My husband was there doing his MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And I felt like, so at that, I was, I guess, like basically 10 years out of college when I was there. And suddenly the setting of a set of college kids and a college dorm floor began to seem intriguing to me as a setting for fiction in a way that I never would have expected. And I think it was something about a decade had passed since my own college experience, and I was back in a college town kind of observing from afar the strange rituals of college students in the town where in Iowa City. And I just started to, so that was sort of, just bubbling in my ordinary life and the things I was seeing every day. And then at the same time, I had always had an interest in contagion stories. One of my favorite novels is Blindness by Jose Saramago. And in that story, and a sort of sudden contagion of an inexplicable blindness comes over a city. So very quickly, one by one, everyone in the city loses, or almost everyone loses their eyesight. And of course, because no one is prepared, and these are people who, blindness has come on them very suddenly, the city is not well prepared, and things, there's a lot of cascading consequences from as a kind of on a societal level when that happens. So anyway, that's a book that I read in when I was in graduate school. And I remember it just really, something about it just really affected me. Um, I remember I had saved, I shouldn't say this as a prof now that I'm a creative writing professor, but I had saved my work to the sort of last minute, um, like to the day before the class that and I had to read this and like I hadn't even started the book before class. And I told my friend, like, I was like, I don't know. I don't think I don't know if I can, I'm not going to finish it. Like, I'm not even going to try to finish it because it's, class is, 18 hours away or 24 hours away. And my friend who had finished it, she's like, no, 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 no. She's like, it's amazing. You have to read it. So I was like, well, I'm a slow reader also. So I started reading it. And then, once I was, 50 pages in, I realized like I absolutely had to finish it, not just to be a good student, but because I could not imagine, sitting in a class and having it discussed or having everything given away, the plot story given away. Um, yeah, for a book that I was so enthralled in. So I just read it in not one sitting, but close, because I was just so so enthralled. And I think it was something about just a really immersive reading experience. And I think it showed me, before that I was really sort of focused on straight realism, and books that focus on like, everyday ordinary human experience, which remains one of my interests, as I said before. But this book showed me how maybe there was a way, blindness showed me how maybe there's a way to combine, like to bring in a big dramatic and impossible premise, but through that focus really closely on characters and the moments between people. So anyway, that book really stayed with me. And later I came across this idea that Saramago has, which he called the possibility of the impossible. So maybe he starts with a kind of outlandish premise, like a city, everyone in a city losing their eyesight at the same time, or some similarly impossible premise. But then from then on, he sort of had this idea that he was going to follow closely the kind of logical consequences of that initial impossible premise. And that's just a concept that has really stayed with me for both of my books. And that's why I feel like for me, I really come out of a kind of realist tradition as a reader, like the things that I love reading. But then I love to combine that sense of reality and the interest in the texture of reality with a kind of big picture, big and kind of unreal premise. So it's a long way of saying that blindness was a major early influence for me. And so by the time I was thinking about writing The Dreamers, about 10 years had passed since college, and almost that long since I'd read Blindness. But I always kind of knew I might want to tell my own Contagion story. So while I was in Iowa City with all these college students, I just got the idea of like, what if some kind of strange contagious disease started on a college dorm floor, which, and in a way that freshman dorm floor has a kind of trapped in quarantine feel anyway, just in an ordinary situation. And so just a lot of ideas kind of quickly suggested themselves to me once I started thinking about that. So I started writing this new idea of a strange contagious disease spreading on a college dorm floor. But I actually did not know immediately what the symptom was, what would happen to these people. But I did sort of know that I wanted it to have a kind of something a little bit wondrous, a little bit outside of reality. I wasn't going to tell, like, it wasn't going to be influenza. I wanted it to have something a little speculative. So that's where I started thinking about what might it be. And during those weeks, this part, whenever I tell this, it feels like a little too good to be true, as if it's concocted by like the marketing department of my publisher. But it is a true fact that I got the idea that while I was working on this contagious disease spreading through a college dorm floor, one morning I had a strange dream. That's the part that feels concocted by the marketing department. And the dream was very simple and brief, but it was just that I couldn't wake up, that I was trying to wake up and I couldn't wake up. And it was just like I was in my bedroom, familiar circumstances in the dream. And the only thing that was different was that I was having trouble waking up, that I couldn't wake up. And pretty quickly after I finally actually did wake up, I thought, that's it. That's what the symptoms should be. That's what this mysterious sickness should be. A disease that causes, or a virus that causes this experience, something like what I had had, which was this feeling of being, and actually in the book, it's a reality of being kind of trapped in sleep. And then eventually in the book, it becomes clear that there's something kind of amazing and strange about the dreams that people are having while they're in this sleep state. But that sort of comes later. But anyway, so those were the kind of kernels. And once I had that, once I had that sleep idea, the combination of the contagion and the sleep in a college town, I knew that I had arrived at something that I could write, like a book that I could write. And I think it's because I recognize that territory of a contagious sleeping sickness as a territory that I love in fiction, which is this space of intersection between the ordinary and the extraordinary. And sleep is such a great example of something like that, because we obviously all spend, 6, 7, 8 hours a day in this state of sleep, but scientists really don't fully understand, what everything that's going on when we're asleep, or why we do it. There's still debates about that. And then we certainly don't have very good access or understanding to what, as individuals, what's going on in our brains while we're sleeping or while we're dreaming. And so I love writing about subjects and territory like that, where there's just this space that we're really intimately familiar with, and yet we don't fully understand, or we don't understand it at all. And even scientists don't understand it very well. And that space is where I just feel like there's space for the imagination in that kind of territory. And I think that's what I like to write about, and where I like to spend time as a writer. So that from then on, not that it was quick. It took me about 4 years from that moment of realizing this could work to actually finishing the novel. And during that time, maybe this might be one reason why it took me so long. I had 2 babies during the time of the writing of this book. And that also explains why parenting ends up being sort of one of the themes, because I haven't said much about the other characters, but this is really like an ensemble book. So there's May, the character that I was just reading about, but there's also a young couple who have a newborn baby during this time. There's a couple who's one of whom, they're both professors, 2 men who also live in the town who are involved, and there's 2 young girls whose father is sort of like a survivalist who has kind of predicted that something like this would happen. So yeah, those are all the characters, or most of them. And yeah, probably that young couple, it's definitely not, it's not based on my husband and I, but those sections are the parts that I drew the most closely, probably on my own experience, just specifically of what it's like to care for a newborn baby. And like, I think that's an example of how when I said before that I love that combination of the ordinary and extraordinary, I think just bringing home a newborn baby is that exact same type of territory, where of course we're all, every one of us has been brought home as a newborn baby. Many of us have brought our own newborn home babies. So it's a common experience. It's an everyday experience, but it just remains kind of, when you're living through it, or even when you just spend time thinking about how amazing and strange and weird it is, that space felt like another really rich, ordinary, extraordinary time of life that I really loved writing about. And in that sense, in this book, I found that laying over this scary pandemic, I mean, it wasn't a pandemic in the book, it's not a pandemic, but this scary contagion over the time of newborn, like raising a newborn, laying over those things felt really right, because that newborn time is a time of such, in my experience, so much fear on the part of the parent, that it felt really natural to write about those things together. And that I remember when I had my first daughter when I had written about 70 pages of this book. So I had written the part that I read to you all just now, but I was having some trouble figuring out what was going on with some of the other characters, and especially this young couple who already did exist in the book, but they didn't have any children. And so I had my first daughter, and I remember when she was 11 days old, I suddenly was like, I know what this book needs. It needs a newborn baby. And I feel like in the moment when I wrote a few lines about things that I had already, just weird details that I had already observed and noticed about what it's like to have a newborn baby. And I remember at the time I was like, who knows if this is going to make it into the book? You know, I just had a baby 11 days ago. I'm still recovering. I'm not sleeping. You know, who knows if this will make it in? But actually, that turned out to be a really kind of crucial turning point for me, realizing this big role that the baby and this couple would play. And later, I wouldn't have been able to imagine the book without it. So maybe that makes me think that the only benefit of taking kind of a long time to write a book is that you get a lot of new material that you don't always expect over the course of those years. You know, if I had been a fast writer and I wrote this book in, you know, in a year before I had my daughter, then all this like all these weird baby details and the like intense fear of parenting at that age would never have made it into the book. And I feel like it really has been an important theme. So yeah, you know, there's an advantage to taking what feels like a long time to write a book. So let's see. I think maybe now I will turn. I just want to reiterate that I'm looking forward to answering any questions you might have. But before that, maybe I will pause to talk a bit about what it's been like to have published a book that, in some ways, like a lot of readers have noticed, had some kind of uncanny parallels to what became reality. And I might read a few brief sections from the book that I myself was kind of found to be kind of eerie, especially at the beginning of this pandemic. I think I would say that that's at the moment the number one question I get, or just comment, which is like, you know, more than one person has been like, oh, how did, you know, are you psychic? Did you predict the future? You know, definitely not. I think the kinds of things that show up in my book that are kind of uncanny is like, you know, there's a line that I imagined stores running out of face masks, or one of the most kind of emotional ones for me was early on in the pandemic. Those pictures came out of people visiting loved ones in nursing homes through a window, you know, and that something similar happens in my book. So there were like a lot of moments like that just felt kind of uncanny. And like I said, I think it's definitely not that I have no special psychic ability. I think it really, that those sense of kind of rhyming of things that happened in my book with what happened in reality, I think it just comes from the fact that you know, history repeats itself, and that I did a lot of research for this book about how contagious disease spread and how societies react. And so I think it's really just that history kind of, you know, predicts, unfortunately, in this kind of case, history predicts the future. And my husband reminded me after the fact that actually that detail of visiting someone through a window came from a story that his grandmother told us once about visiting her mother in, you know, the 1930s in a tuberculosis hospital, or at a tuberculosis hospital, where she was for several months, and the kids would come and just see, you know, wave to her through the window. So that just shows how, you know, a kind of picking up historical details about these things, that led me to put it in my fiction, in my imaginary world. And then, but then reality sort of was repeating history. And then it felt, but that's why, like, my book was sort of the middleman in that. But I am going to read a few quick passages that maybe show, are the kind of passages that feel strange to me and to readers that I wrote them, so long before our current situation. So let's see. One, probably I wrote both of these in around 2015. So here's the first one. These will just be short. Meanwhile, on that same night, in another part of town, the swirling sounds of an organ are streaming out into the street. A row of bridesmaids stands shivering outside a church. Every wedding after this one will be canceled or postponed. But this one goes through, the last vows to be said in this town. The bride has been feeling woozy all day. It's normal, her mother says, just nerves. And anyway, she was up so late the night before, finalizing the seating arrangements after a long day of work, a nurse in a doctor's office. No wonder she feels so tired. She does look a little pale, the bridesmaids agree, but 2 smears of blush put the color back into her face, and an extra layer of concealer hides the gray beneath her eyes. But whoever shares her lipstick that day, whoever borrows her eyeliner, whoever kisses her cheek that night, or dances too close, or clinks her flute of champagne, whoever touches her hand to admire the ring, whoever catches the bouquet at the end of the night, all of them, every one, is exposed. This is how the sickness travels best, through all the same channels as do fondness and friendship and love. I don't remember coming across the word social distancing when I was researching, but I feel like I must have, but that particular phrase didn't come up, but obviously, the research definitely led me, and life experience led me to write. I guess that's my version of social distancing, that line about how the sickness travels. And let's see, I think I'll read maybe just one more. And this one's kind of different. I'd say one of the challenges of writing this book for me was transitioning from, in my first novel, it's a first person narrator, and it very much follows a kind of the natural rules of of a first person narrator who's looking back on something that happened in the past, which I found to be a very natural way to write, because obviously all of us as storytellers, that's how we tell our stories, this is what happened to me when I was a kid. This is what it was like on this certain day. But when it came time to write The Dreamers, I knew I had this this feeling that it should be in third person, because part of writing a contagion story, part of the possibility of it felt like it could partly be about the connections between people, when there is I think this is probably true in our real world, and definitely when I was imagining it, I was thinking that the person who lives alone in the woods is never going to catch whatever sickness is spreading. And so I knew this was going to be a book about people living in relatively, close proximity, and all the ways that the sickness would travel through those, linkages and webs. And so because of that, I wanted to have a big cast of characters, and I wanted to have this third person voice who was sort of semi-omniscient, who could kind of go into different people's heads and different parts of town to capture this unfolding crisis from different points of view. But that was a big challenge for me to figure out kind of how to get that voice right, because it's so different from the first person of my novel, and it's also a kind of voice that it sort of only exists in a novel, which I think is something really wonderful about fiction, that there are these things that can only live in a novel. So the omniscient third person voice was a big part of the challenge of writing this book. And so in this, I did sort of fall in love with it, because it has a lot of, as a writer, I like what it could do as a writer, because it has a lot of elasticity and ability to kind of travel anywhere, it felt like, when I was writing in this voice. And so this last piece that I'll read is an example of kind of pushing that to, as far as I could. So in this moment, we're kind of even outside of the town for a moment, and the voice is kind of inhabiting a kind of uh, general observer, or a series of observers sort of from the outside, which you'll see. And there's sort of quite a bit of irony rather than just a straightforward, it's not meant to be a straightforward capturing of what the book thinks is going on, or certainly what I think is going on, but you'll see, and I'm reading it because it also, again, I wrote it in maybe 2016, but I think it also feels a bit familiar in terms of our current pandemic politics. By now, certain alternate theories are beginning to circulate online. It's the government, they say, or it's big pharma. Some kind of germ must have gotten loose from a lab at the college. Think about it, they say. Do you really believe that a completely new virus could show up in the most powerful country on earth without scientists knowing exactly what it is? They probably engineered it themselves. They might be spreading this thing on purpose, testing out a biological weapon. They might be withholding the cure. Or maybe there's no sickness at all. That's what some have begun posting online. Isn't Santa Laura the perfect location for a hoax? An isolated town surrounded by forest, only one road in and one road out. And those people you see on TV, those could be hired victims. Those could be crisis actors paid to play their parts. And the supposedly sick? Come on, how hard is it to pretend you're asleep? Maybe a few begin to say, Santa Laura is not even a real town. Has anyone ever heard of this place? And look it up. There's no such saint as Santa Laura. It's made up. The whole damn place is probably just a set on some back lot in Culver City. Don't those houses look a little too quaint? Don't be naive, say others. They don't need a set. All that footage is probably just streaming out of some editing room in the valley. If you look closely, you can tell that some of those houses repeat. Now just ask yourself, they say, who stands to benefit from all of this? It always comes back to money, right? The medical industrial complex. And who do you think pays the salaries of these so-called journalists reporting all this fake news? Just watch. In a few months, Big Pharma will be selling the vaccine. So I think I'll pause with the reading there, and I would love to just check if there are questions, and then I do have a few other things to go into if there are not questions now, but just I would love some if there are, and I want to make sure we have time. So I'll just do a check-in. Do we have any questions so far?
And if you have any questions, you can feel free to just type those in the chat.
Or maybe I'll have you, if you have questions, go ahead and write them in if you do have questions. If not, it's fine. But I'll talk a bit about how my sort of journey as a writer, and then if I see if questions come in, then I'll answer them then. So as Kirsten said at the beginning, I grew up in California, which I guess that's something I haven't talked about so much, but both of my books are set in California. And I think I originally tried to set the Dreamers in Iowa City because, as I mentioned before, I was living there at the time that I started writing it. But I found I just didn't know Iowa well enough to write about it the way that I like to write about a place. And I felt like I just had to go back to California as a setting, because I think there's just something about the place where you grow up, or at least in my case, where just the relationship, the kind of tactile relationship that you can have to a place, I feel like is just most pronounced if you spend your childhood there. I think there's just something about childhood, maybe like the time you spend like digging in the dirt and rolling in the grass, and just those early formative memories for me have so much. I just have so much sensory memory that and understanding of the kind of habits and cultures of how people live, like in the case of California, how people live in the kind of shadow of specific natural disasters was something that was just part of me. And so I remember when I was trying to write the novel in Iowa City, I tried to write, I had a scene about a tornado warning happening, because that's common issue in Iowa. And I think that scene was okay, but like I just didn't know the places deeply. So in the end, I changed that particular scene. I kept the scene, but the disruption was the appearance of a wildfire in the forest around, in the woods around Santa Laura. And that just shows, like, I just instantly, it was so much easier to write for me because growing up in a place, which I'm sure all of us Oregonians can also identify with, unfortunately, I just felt much more in touch with what those risks are like and what the psychological feeling is. Yeah. So anyway, so I grew up there, but I haven't lived in California for a long time. But I did, I sort of that's when I sort of got serious about writing, which was in California when I was in college at UCLA. And I studied with the writers Amy Bender and Mona Simpson in creative writing workshops. And they were both just incredibly influential for me. And I just, that's where I just started to really try to figure, like, I think I went from being a reader who loved to write to kind of deciding to really try to take this seriously and figure out how to write fiction. So then after that, I did my MFA at Columbia in New York. And there I had some great teachers there and met some really important friends and readers who are still, other writers who are still really important to me as readers and friends now almost 20 years ago, which is 18 years ago. But so when I was in graduate school is when I first wrote, I wrote a short story that ended up being what I later turned into my first novel, The Age of Miracles. But there was kind of a big lag time. So I wrote that story and then I finished while I was in graduate school, finished my MFA. And then after that, I wanted to stay in New York and I found a job in book publishing. So I wrote The Age of Miracles while working full-time in book publishing. So first I was an editorial assistant, and by the end it was a kind of a junior editor, starting to do some of my own books. So all that was at Simon Schuster, and I was there for about 6 years. And that, I guess, was probably a sort of second. So the MFA was really important, but working in book publishing and reading tons of books that were in process and sort of having practice helping other writers tighten up their stories and their sentences, and conceiving of a story at a book length. I think all of that was really, my time in publishing was really useful in that sense. And then I did that until I sold my first book, and then the temptation to focus on writing became too great because publishing, being an editor is a really wonderful job, but it is really can take over your life. And it was hard to imagine, continuing to write while doing that job. Although there are some editors that make it work. But I also sort of realized that I loved teaching. So since I left my job, I started to do some creative writing teaching. And then about 4 years ago, I got this full-time job at the University of Oregon and have been really happy there. And I know that that's been good for my writing as well. So yeah, that's sort of now I just balance teaching and writing. And I feel like there's a question related to teaching. I'm going to pause here. I don't know if
Yeah, so Catherine asks, what do you think as a teacher is the most challenging concept to teach your students about writing?
That's a good question. I think, there's a debate about whether you can teach writing, and I think there's a lot about short story writing and novel writing that can definitely be learned. And so I think of my job as a teacher, maybe this is a semantic difference, but it's like I'm helping them learn more than me teaching them, like, this is how you write a story, because everyone in some sense has to discover on their own how to write the kind of story that they want to write, but the more we dig into other texts and one another's work, I think the more individual students start to see pathways for, how they can write their own stories. But I think in terms of I think the hardest thing to teach, or maybe even the thing that I think is you maybe can't teach, is like just an affinity to language, and like an ear for language. I think that to me feels like it has to do with like your brain and your sense of music, um I mean, luckily a lot of people who are interested in creative writing have some of that, because that's part of their reading experience, the appreciation of like the poetics of language and the sound and the music of language. So a lot of people do have that, but I feel like it's hard. A lot of students, I feel like it's hard to kind of teach, because it's almost built into your brain. Something that I do think is learnable, but it's hard, is structure. So I know that for me, when I was in graduate school, a structure of a story was something I had no sense of when I entered, and it was something I really um, thought a lot about and learned a lot from my teachers. Not so much from them saying, "Oh, here's how to structure something," but just calling my attention again and again to how other books are structured started to help me see structure, like, or just kind of speak the language of structure, or recognize structure in a piece of writing in a way that I hadn't before.
And a follow-up to that is, how do you model the concepts? And why do you encourage? I'm not sure if you meant why or what do you encourage, but either one.
Mhm. Oh, wait, sorry. Was that the end? What do I encourage? So how do you?
Yes, what do you encourage and how do you model the concepts?
Oh, yeah. I mean, let's see. I mean, for one thing, a lot of the teaching I'm doing is creative writing workshops, and so in that case, we are all practicing. I mean, the students and myself, we're all practicing. Reading really carefully, closely other people's um, work, and so that itself, like, and then the discussion we have around it in the class, I think that itself is, the more times you do that, the more you're able to do that, I hope, for your own work. At least that's been my experience, and I think that's part of the idea of the creative writing workshop is looking at people's work when it's not quite finished, or they haven't quite figured everything out. It makes it easier. Sometimes it's easier to see the pieces than it is in published finished work. And then I think that practice of again and again and again being like, wait, this isn't clear, or I don't quite believe this character, or this structure doesn't make sense, or the pacing doesn't make sense, or doesn't work. I think the more you develop that skill, the more you can use it in your own writing. And I feel like the ability to imagine yourself as the reader of your own work. I mean, like, imagining that it's not your own work, I guess I should say, is a really key and maybe under discussed um, like strategy that every writer needs, like to be able to imagine what it's like to read this text that you're writing when you're not the author, you know? And I think just carefully reading and discussing each other's work, and also published work in that way, I feel like that's the most important skill, and the most important thing that you can maybe learn in a workshop. um, and I always try to model like really close reading, so like looking at one page, especially like a first page, looking at what each line is doing, and how it's moving just on a single page. And I think that hopefully helps helps call the student's attention to the power of like every sentence on a page.
Our next question is from Melanie, who says, I really love The Age of Miracles and look forward to reading The Dreamers. I would call your work something like literary weird, but not science fiction fantasy. What other writers would you recommend that are literary weird? And to that, I would add one of my own questions, which is, do you think of your writing as science fiction or more like science fiction adjacent?
Yeah, I like science fiction adjacent, maybe. I mean, I'm happy for people to um, like, I definitely play work with science fiction premises, uh, but I don't come out of the world of science fiction like as a reader. I don't. I feel like that's a whole world. So I'm always hesitant to call myself science fiction, because my work science fiction, because especially for me to call it that, because it just doesn't come out of that tradition. And so there's a whole set of like expectations and um, rules and what's satisfying about that sometimes I'm not doing, or that I don't know about, because I sort of come out of this like, yeah, literary realism, or also, before what I would call realism, or in the literary sense, realism. I also really love just all kinds of modernism, which is also based in reality, but has this kind of impressionistic, like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. So anyway, I come to these speculative premises from that world, and so yeah, so science fiction, I think they are kind of science fiction premises, maybe, but then the focus is different than maybe a science fiction reader would expect. Maybe primarily, I love to write about the science, the imagined science, sort of as it enriches our understanding of the human experience, but it's not going into the amount of technical science that I think some science fiction readers would expect and want uh, from a book. So I think sometimes I like science fiction adjacent. That's interesting. I think some people have called it soft science fiction, or like maybe like humanistic science fiction. So those, those work for me. I think I also like literary weird. I like that. I think, let's see, favorites. In that kind of category, my probably favorite authors, contemporary authors are like Kazuo Ishiguro, who doesn't always write that way, but both Clara and the Sun, his new one, and also Never Let Me Go are two favorites of mine. And I love how they have premises that do sort of come from science fiction, but most of the pages are devoted to like the relationships between people, but it's enriched, I think, by this science fiction like premise. So that's one. And then definitely Karen Russell, who also happens to be a friend of mine from graduate school and who lives and from Portland. She just has an incredible imagination. And so she really roves all kinds of, literary weird is a perfect description for her, because it's not necessarily science fiction, or not always, but it's just all kinds of imaginative premises, like a girl raised as as wolves, or let's see, what is another one, good one, or like ghost stories, or yeah, anyway, I'm not doing it justice, but she is a very famous and obvious example of, I think, literary weird. And then one of my teacher, Amy Bender, my first creative writing teacher, Amy Bender, she's also another great one, where she uses a lot of just like very imaginative, sort of magical realist premises in her stories and novels.
So Catherine Rickbone asks, do you know about the statewide Willamette Writers Organization?
Oh, I do not. But maybe I should. I don't know. Maybe it's something I should look up. I feel like there's still so many Oregon things. I've been here 4 years, and my dad grew up in Oregon, so it felt a little like, coming. He doesn't live here now, but it sort of felt a little coming home to the West Coast. But there's still so many Oregon things, and including this, that I'm still learning and still discovering.
So a question I had is, I noticed in your books this sort of interest in how people respond to disasters and things like that. Are you a fan of disaster movies, or is that just not your thing?
No, that's funny, because I guess the other part of it, when I was saying before that I come from this kind of literary realism or modernism background as a reader, like the things I love. I did as a kid, I loved like Roald Dahl books. So those have that, like the BFG or Witches, like that. They definitely have a not science fiction, but a kind of unreal element. But the other big influence on me in the world of both disaster and like speculative science fiction stuff is movies. That's definitely true. Like, I think I watch, regular disaster movies, but also like science fiction disaster movies. Those, I feel like I really kind of inhale those things more than I have more experience watching those kinds of stories than reading books about those things. So I think maybe my books are like some kind of marriage of like the Hollywood disaster movie with like a literary realism, you know. um, Although
Love
I feel like
that.
I haven't, it's been a little while since I've seen a good one. I have to,
Oh, I
I,
watched San Andreas the other night and it was really fun.
oh, yeah, I haven't seen that one.
It's got The Rock in it. It's,
Uh-huh.
San Francisco is sliding off of the coast of California, and there's a
Uh-huh.
tsunami and the whole thing.
Uh-huh.
But it's kind of nice because it's one of those ones where like they keep showing you people being kind to each other and heroic,
Mm-hmm.
even just in the background, and it's kind of like, yeah, it gives you faith in humanity.
Oh, that's nice. I think that's my one complaint about, well, it's my complaint, but then I've occasionally had people complain about my books in the opposite direction, which is feel like there's an idea in our culture that, and it shows up in Hollywood movies, that like a lot of people are going to be their worst selves in a disaster situation. And I'm kind of interested. It's not so much that like in The Dreamers or The Age of Miracles that people aren't necessarily their best selves. They're just their ordinary selves. And I sort of feel like I write about people who are like mostly doing their best. And like doesn't mean that they're perfect or they're going to be heroes, but they're probably not going to be like, murdering people for supplies either,
You're
So
not going to have feral gangs roving like 10 minutes
yeah,
after
yeah,
the
yeah.
disaster happens. Jonathan had a question. Do you spend time plotting out your books extensively with an outline, or do you write off the cuff? What's your process like?
I would say it's sort of a mix. I mean, I like to write in chronological order. I mean, not just chronological order in terms of the story, although I guess that's probably true, but for sure the order that the chapter is going to appear. And so then that means that for me, I have a premise and I have some characters, but I can kind of start working even if I don't know everything that's going to happen, because I'm sort of charting the story, hopefully along the lines of logic as I go. But I do like to have a kind of a sense of where it's going. And especially as I hit to sort of a halfway, like third halfway mark, and then I start to want to know more about the path, figure out what the exact path is going to be. But I don't like, I don't outline it in a really detailed way. And I think that's because for me, like part of the fun of writing is is my own suspense about what's going to happen. And I know that for some people they need to write like a whole out, like a thick detailed outline. But if I were to do that, I mean, one, I'm not sure I could do it anyway, but if I were, I think I would have used up my imaginative energy and interest for the writing, for the actual writing of the scenes. I would feel like, oh, then I have to write like this scene, and then I have to write, I know exactly what the next scene to write is. And something about that I think wouldn't work for me. But I know a lot of writers who do that and it works for them. That's the thing I love about writing in general, and hearing about how other writers work, is everyone, it's so intimately tied to your own personality. Like there's no one way to tell a story, or to know one process, Any other
Any other
questions?
questions? Coming up on 5 o'clock, so we'll probably start wrapping up soon. But I did wonder what you're reading and loving, or even watching and loving right now.
Let's see. Well, they just finished Claire and the Sun, which I did. I already mentioned the book, which I loved. Um, yeah. What else? I'm trying to think about what else. I'll leave that as my recent book recommendation. That I've I've read a few other things that I didn't love as much, and I feel like we don't need to get into the ones that I didn't love. Um, but in terms of watching, let's see, I'm currently watching the White Lotus. I mean, I can't remember if it's the White Lotus or just White Lotus. White Lotus, anyway, which doesn't have very much to do with the kind of things that I write, but it's something that I love. And I'm very much looking forward to watching Succession season 2, which is, I think, very close to starting. So sometimes I watch things. I guess those are examples of things that are pretty different from what I write, but it's a good escape.
Oh, and we have a question from Catherine who asks, do you like Isabella Allende?
I haven't read much of her. Do you have I feel like she's a bit of a hole in do you have one that you recommend in particular that I should start with?
No, I don't either, actually, because again, same as you, I haven't read enough of her, I don't think.
So many.
Maybe we should form a book club.
Yeah. Yeah, if any other questions, or else or else I'll say thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. This was delightful, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And we will have the video edited and up on YouTube. So if you are brave enough to see what you look like on Zoom, please feel free to check it out. And of course, those of you who have attended, please let your friends know that even if they missed it today, they'll be able to watch it probably on Monday.
Okay,
in our
great.
next
Thanks so
week,
much.
our authors will be Kelly Sue DeConnick and Matt Fraction, the comic book creators, and they will be joining us at 4 o'clock next Thursday. So hope to see you all there. And thank you again. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.